Stephen's Song by Hannah Crawford and Kenn Crawford. Performed by R.E. Chambliss. The car lights flashed on the window when it turned into the yard. Expectancy stilled all sound and movement in the tiny kitchen. 3 women, 2 in their 20s, and their mother-in-law, Anne Shaw, a fine-featured woman of 53 with light blonde hair, heard the car stop outside, heard the rubber-cushioned clunk of the door closing. Anne's breath caught in her throat. Seconds later, the kitchen door opened, and Tom came inside. The dreadful premonition Anne had been fighting since she received word of the mine explosion became a cold certainty when she saw her husband. It was there, naked in his face. The news was bad. Tom's eyes met hers. "John is all right." Tom's voice sounded hurried, yet hesitant. He wasn't in the section where the explosion happened. A wash of relief fell over Anne. John is safe. Her eyes met her husband's. There was more. "Stephen," Tom started to say, but his voice had failed him. Anne closed her eyes, horrified. "Oh, God, no, not Stephen," she thought, "not my baby." She opened her eyes when Tom found his voice again. "I ran into Stan Morrison at the mine, and he told me that Stephen was hurt in the explosion and that John was with him at the hospital." "Did he say?" Anne heard herself asking. "He said Stephen should be all right," he reassured her, placing a shaky hand on her shoulder. 12 men are dead. They don't know yet how many are hurt." He paused, then said slowly, "It was an ugly sight, watching the bodies being carried out of the shaft." 12 dead, Anne thought. 12 homes in which the loss was total, the anguish bottomless. "Did you see Will?" Ruth, one of the younger women, asked in a hopeful yet desperate voice. "He and the other draggermen are still looking for survivors." "I never wanted him to be on the rescue team," she muttered coldly. "The danger." "Nobody wants to be a draggerman," her father-in-law said simply. "But somebody has to do it, and Will is an able man." "But what's being strong against... She broke off, struggling with her fear. Silence followed her unfinished sentence. Tom was right, of course. Coal mines were dangerous, deadly. Draggermen were trained mine rescue men, miners willing to risk their own lives to save their mining brothers and, God forbid, bring out the dead. "I'll make you a cup of hot tea," Anne said, breaking the cold silence that enveloped the tiny kitchen as she filled the kettle and placed it on the coal stove. Tom, a tall, lean man whose dying lungs had rendered him gaunt and slow-moving, nodded slowly as he laid his hat on the refrigerator, then crossed to the kitchen to sit at the family table. The black under his eyes underscored the condition of his lungs. Years of breathing deadly coal dust had left its dreaded mark on him. For some men, like Tom, the coal mines steal their life in the slow, irreversible disease known simply as black lung. For other miners, death came as quick as a flash. My father's father was a coal miner's son. Grandfather worked with the black on his lungs. He watched his brother die by his side, digging a living in a Cape Breton mine. "Don't go below, son. Don't ride the rake down. Don't dig your living in the deep underground. Head west, young man. Your dreams can be found, leaving a coal dust town." Coal Dust Town played over and over in Tom's mind like a record with a faulty groove, taunting him, mocking him. How many times had he urged his sons to head west, to Toronto or Calgary, and make a life for themselves away from these damned mines? How many times has he heard them say, Glace Bay is our home. This is where we belong." Neither Tom nor Anne went to bed that night. Sleep would not come until they heard word. Anne wanted to go to the hospital. So did Tom, but he knew there was nothing they could do. Being at the hospital in the middle of a mining disaster would only make matters worse. Anne did not need to see something like that. John was with Stephen and would bring word as soon as there was something to report. So they both sat in a silent vigil at the kitchen table, taking turns staring at the phone that did not ring and jumping to look out the window whenever a car light would flash by. Eventually, dawn broke, then first light. John's wife Sarah arrived with their new baby, and Will's wife, Ruth, arrived a few minutes later. Both women seeking comfort in the Shaw home in their husband's absence. John at the hospital with Stephen, Will searching the mine for survivors. Finally, John came, and Anne instantly felt her spirits lift. John looked, as always, not a bit disheartened. She threw her arms around him. "Thank God you're okay," and kissed his coal-covered cheek. John smiled his reassuring smile, then leaned down and kissed the sleeping baby on the head, and then his wife, before turning to face everyone. "Stephen is going to be all right," he told the anxious faces, his own face taking a more somber look. "Burned. They were all burned." "Burned?" Sarah exclaimed. "I thought it was an explosion, not a fire." "Fire comes after the explosion," John explained to her patiently. Sarah was a kind and sweet soul, but was not swift about a lot of things. "Stephen?" his mother softly prompted. "I knew there was an explosion before the alarm even sounded. We all felt it. We were heading out when someone told me the explosion was on the B wall. I knew that's where Stephen was working, so I headed back down to find him. The shift boss told me to wait for the rescue team, but I said to hell with that and kept going. Stan Morrison came with me." His eyes met his father's. "It was bad. Some timbers were burning, so Stan and I threw stone dust on them to put the fire out." Tom nodded his approval. It had been the right thing to do. If a cave-in released methane gas, the entire mine and everyone in it would be buried forever. "You could have been killed," Sarah said absent-mindedly. John looked at her with something that was at once understanding yet impatient about his glance, and then continued. "I found Stephen. He knew me. He wanted to know if his work buddy Archie was all right. He said dust had gotten into his eyes and he couldn't see where Archie was. His eyes were all red and raw. I shined my light over at Stan, who was bending over Archie. Stan shook his head, and I knew that Archie was gone. I told Stephen that Archie was okay. Stephen was talking and everything, and I asked him if he could walk. He started to stand up, and then he just collapsed. Shock, I guess. Stan ran ahead and got a stretcher, and we carried Stephen out to the rake. By that time, the rescue crew was coming down. Stan told them where Archie was, and he helped me take Stephen to the surface and put him in an ambulance. I went with Stephen to the hospital, and Stan went back down the rake to help with the rescue." "I must thank Stan," Anne said. "Stan doesn't want thanks," he told her. "Not for something like that." "You must be hungry," Sarah said to John, instinctively seeking to put things right by re-establishing a familiar pattern. He nodded. Anne took her sleeping grandson to lay him down in the small room off the kitchen as Sarah started to busy herself at the stove. With the aroma of frying bacon and the soft clink of the dishes, familiar things, the tension in the kitchen eased. Anne could feel the cold, bowel-gripping sickness in her retreating. God had spared Stephen, and she was grateful for that. When Anne and Tom arrived at the hospital, the staff treated them with consideration that bordered on reverence. Stephen lay in a transparent tent-like affair, shrouded in bandages, even his eyes were covered. From suspended bottles of fluid, a tube ran to the bed and disappeared under the white sheet covering him. He was as still as death. She looked at the nurse. "Sedated," the nurse told her in a hushed voice. "It's in the intravenous." The nurse smiled warmly and motioned for them to take the 2 chairs on the other side of the bed. They sat in silence as the nurse fussed with the tent, touched the tube in the checking manner, then withdrew, leaving them alone with Stephen. His bandaged eyes troubled Anne, and she recalled John saying that his eyes had been red and raw. Anne shifted uneasily in her chair, and in the silence her mind took refuge from the thoughts of damaged vision and seared flesh by drifting back. She remembered finishing high school with a scholarship to Teachers College when she was 15 and teaching in her first classroom before she was 17. Teacher training was a 1-year course in those days. 3 years later, she and Tom were married. Tom was a kind, loving man, and that had counted more with her than his good looks, though she had always been a bit proud of his looks. In time, the coal dust wreaked its slow havoc on Tom's lungs, but he doggedly continued to work, despite her protesting, as long as he was able. Eileen was her firstborn, fine-boned with light coloring like herself. John and Will, dark and strong-bodied like Tom, arrived in quick succession and were followed 5 years later by Stephen. John and Will were close-knit, their early years tumultuous, and she had to suffer complaints from the neighbors about their fist-fighting with the other neighborhood boys. But in their late teens, they grew less fractious and became more like their father, quiet-mannered and steady. Though indifferent students, John and Will did well enough in school, but Stephen did not do well. She worked closely with him at his homework, but his marks were barely enough to pass. Concerned, she met with his teacher, Mr. MacDonald. She warmed immediately to him, a discerning man in his early 40s, unmistakably dedicated to his calling. He had listened to her concerns and smiled understandingly. "You need not be concerned, Mrs. Shaw," he told her. "Stephen is not in the least bit slow. In fact, as I am sure you are well aware, he is quite intelligent. The problem, and I've given this some considerable thought, is that we are failing to convince Stephen that what we are teaching here is important to him. Stephen has his own set of values, and as the old saying goes, he marches to the beat of a different drum. A beautiful drum, really. Would more of us marched to his kind of drum, the world would be a better place. I spend quite a bit of time with the boys coaching their teams and supervising their play. Observing them in roles other than in the classroom gives one curious insights, one of which is what they consider to be important. Take Stephen and the deaf boy, for example. "Vincent?" Anne had murmured. "Mrs. Quinn's boy." He nodded. "Stephen brought him to me during practice, and he wanted Vincent to play on the ball team. Naturally, I tried to fit him into the team, but, shut off as he was in his world of silence, it would have been hopeless were it not for Stephen's extraordinary empathy with him. It was a fascinating thing to watch, really, the mysterious communication that existed between them. During the heat of play, Vincent's eyes would flash, often frantically, and Stephen would respond instantly with a quick, inexplicable motion that only Vincent could understand. The other boys became infected by Stephen's deep concern for his deaf friend, and in time, they made him one of them. Slowly, a wondrous sense of belonging grew in Vincent, and Stephen glowed with pleasure because of his friend's happiness. What I'm trying to say, Mrs. Shaw, is that you have no cause for concern. Stephen will make his contribution to life, for I have never seen in anyone else his unselfish concern for the happiness of others." Over the years, Stephen continued to receive average grades in school, but his concern for others never flagged. That had been apparent in him at an early age. Unhappiness, anyone's unhappiness, distressed him. They all knew that Stephen could only be happy when those around him were happy. It was the reason for his extreme delight in festive occasions. He eagerly looked forward to and orchestrated the family's participation in each other's birthdays and the whole calendar of special days, climaxing with Christmas, the happiest day of all. The older boys smiled and made asides to each other about it, but sensing his need, and out of respect for it, everyone joined him in celebrating each birthday and festive occasion. They were to Stephen times for shared happiness, and he made the occasions exactly that in a special way for the whole family. Her mind dwelt on the many ways Stephen made life nicer for all of them. The nurse came into the room at regular intervals to check the flow of fluid from the suspended bottles, then silently withdrew. Few words passed between Anne and Tom. Few were needed. Shared concern, the need for hope and patience, did not find in them a need for words. Hours melted together in the stillness. It was nearing the end of visiting hours, and a gentle rumbling in Tom's stomach reminded her they had not eaten since breakfast. "Perhaps we should go now," Anne said. "We can come back tomorrow." Tom motioned to the intravenous tubing where the fluid flow had stopped. "We should mention to the nurse on our way out that the flow had stopped," he said, rising to his feet. Anne wished she could give Stephen a kiss. She kissed her fingers and touched the tent. It was the best she could do. At the nurse's station, an alcove off the main corridor, a tall young man with a stethoscope hanging from his neck was standing beside the nurse studying a chart. When they paused at the counter, the nurse glanced at them and asked, "Visit over?" Anne nodded and said, "We'll be back in the morning. The fluid has stopped flowing in the intravenous. We thought you might like to check on it." "I will, Mrs. Shaw, right away." As they continued down the corridor, the nurse was moving towards Stephen's room. Harry McNeil, a neighborhood man in his late 50s, appeared in the doorway of one of the 4-bed wards in his pajamas as they were passing. He thrust out his hand, first to Tom, then Anne. "Sorry, real sorry about Stephen." Tom nodded. "It's a bad time for everyone." "We didn't know you were in here, Harry," Anne told him, trying to lighten the mood. "Been in a week now, trouble with my drainage system." He motioned into the ward. "Can you visit for a minute?" Anne and Tom exchanged a quick glance, their eyes speaking a silent language only married couples understood. "Sure," Tom said, as he placed his hand in the small of Anne's back to lead her into the room. "But only for a minute or two." "Sarah is bringing the baby over," Anne said, in her best "grandma wants to see the baby" voice, but her eyes betrayed her. If Anne was going to sit in a hospital room, it was going to be in Stephen's room. The 3 other patients in the ward were all people they knew. Life in a small coal mining town like Glace Bay meant you knew practically everyone, and during times like these, the entire community felt your pain and shared in your loss. Each man expressed their regrets about Stephen and offered words of encouragement. "There is talk of sending some of the boys to Halifax," Harry said. "We didn't hear anything about that," Tom answered as he looked to Anne. "They have a special unit up there for burn cases," Harry informed them. Anne winced at the word. "They said that Stephen is not too bad." Her eyes told Tom another story. "He's getting the best of care, I can tell you that," Harry answered. "Am I imagining things?" Anne thought. Had Harry been slow to answer? It sounded more like an evasion than reassurance. Does he know something we do not? Harry was talking to Tom, pulling her attention back to their conversation. The men will be going back to work the day after the funeral. I wouldn't be surprised if the company ordered the men back to work the very same day, Tom answered, with more than a hint of disgust in his voice. Even the loss of human life cannot interrupt the flow of coal for long. Coal was the lifeblood of small coal dust towns like theirs. When tragedy strikes, you bury your dead, mourn your loss, then get back to work. The men of the deep knew but one life: mine the coal at all costs. On the day of the mass funeral for the 12 men who gave their lives to the coal, everyone who could go went. The Shaw boys and their wives were among them, but Anne asked Tom to take her to the hospital to sit with Stephen instead. She was unsure that she could bear to witness the suffering that would take place at the mass interment when Stephen had survived. A small sense of guilt crept into her heart, knowing her son had lived when so many were lost, but her guilt was pushed aside as she remembered him lying helpless in his tiny, sterile tent, suffering his burns alone, without a loving touch to help comfort him. As they walked down the corridor, a nurse stepped out of Stephen's room and, recognizing them, turned and walked back into the room. Anne and Tom exchanged a quizzical look as the nurse reappeared and briskly walked towards them. "Would you and your husband come with me, Mrs. Shaw?" she asked. "The doctor would like to speak with you." Anne looked down towards Stephen's room, then to Tom. His eyes didn't hold the same fear and uneasiness as hers. They nodded and followed the brisk-moving nurse towards a small office. She opened a door and ushered them into the empty office and motioned to 2 plain chairs beside a small desk. "The doctor will be with you in just a moment," she said warmly, but there was something about her voice that worried Anne. When the door closed behind her, Anne said hopefully, "Perhaps Stephen is one of those going to the hospital in Halifax?" Tom nodded. "Probably." 5 uneasy minutes elapsed before the door opened again, and the young man who had been at the nurse's station the previous day came in and closed the door carefully behind him. "You are Stephen Shaw's parents?" They nodded. Neither she nor Tom spoke. "I'm afraid he started to say softly but stopped, trying to find the right words. "Mr. and Mrs. Shaw, there's no easy way to say this. Your son just passed away." For an instant, Anne failed to register what he had said, and then it was as if something pierced her heart. She gave a low, gasping cry, rose from her chair, and turned blindly towards Tom. He came out of his chair and gathered her in his arms. Stillness followed. After a few moments, the doctor broke the uneasy silence. "We don't know what happened. He was showing signs of improvement, and then—" His words broke off again. Anne clung to Tom and felt a shudder run through his body. She lifted her head, looked into his face as his eyes exploded in tears. She straightened her shoulders, gathered her strength, and, turning to the doctor, said, "We'll be all right now. We just need a few moments. Thank you for taking the time with us." She saw his eyes study Tom. "Yes, of course. Take all the time you need. Can I offer you a drive home?" "No need." Tom's voice cracked. He cleared his throat. "Kind of you to offer, but we have a car." The doctor studied him a moment longer. "In that case, I'll leave you alone. Once again, feel free to take as much time as you need." He paused for a moment before adding, "I am very sorry for your loss." The doctor stepped to the door with his hand on the knob, hesitated, then turned to face them. "Dr. O'Neill was your son's physician?" "Yes, he's our family doctor," Tom answered. "He may want an autopsy done." Anne stiffened, as if from a physical blow. My God, he's not cold, and they want to cut him up like some experimental thing? "For what purpose?" Tom's voice held a sharp edge. "This is just a community hospital, not a research center." "We lost your son," the doctor replied. "We don't know why exactly. Finding out what happened may help with the others. You do not need to make a decision right now. Take some time to think." "Tom," Anne said, cutting the doctor off as she turned to her husband. Autopsy was a brutal word that forced her to face the utter finality of death. Never again would she see Stephen's beloved smile that melted the heart, the limber way he moved, be warmed by his manner that prompted others to call him blessed. Had she carried him, nurtured and loved him, so that he would become unresisting flesh to be cut and searched for secrets under cold, harsh lights? Her instinct was to cry out against any violation of his body, but was stayed by the thought of the other men, each helpless in his sterile tent, each within inches of meeting Stephen's fate. She slowly released her pent-up breath and looked deep into Tom's teary eyes. "To the doctor, it is something necessary. To me, us, it's a form of desecration." She paused. "To help the others, we must put aside our fears and allow it." Tom returned her look and felt his head nod slowly in agreement. "I'll give Dr. O'Neill your decision." "When will it be done?" Tom asked, the taste of disdain still on his lips. "If Dr. O'Neill decides to go ahead, and I'm sure he will have the medical examiner from Sydney come in sometime tonight or tomorrow morning at the latest." Once more the doctor hesitated, as if at a loss for words, then quietly withdrew from the room. In the car on the way home, Tom remarked, "His heart must have simply given up." She made no reply. Her internal voice kept repeating, "Snuffed out like a candle flame at 19. Tom continued to talk. She knew it was for her sake. She strove to listen. "Remember," she heard him saying, "the first time I took him fishing at the lake? He caught the biggest fish taken there that day, though he was only a little shaver himself. Then he felt bad because I didn't catch a big one. Almost spoiled his day until I finally convinced him that next time I would get the big one. That satisfied him. He was like that." Anne began to cry softly, and Tom reached over and brushed her cheek. "Now, Anne, Stephen would not want you to cry." But she couldn't help it. They drove the rest of the way home in silence. Sitting in the driveway, neither one of them moved to vacate the car. The house would never be the same. Anne broke the silence. "The boys would be home soon from the—" Her words broke off. She couldn't bring herself to even say the word funeral. The boys and their wives all arrived at the house together. Their somber moods hushed further by the look on their parents' faces. "Stephen," Tom's voice failed him again. Anne jerked to her feet and ran to the bedroom. Her screams of anguish bellowed through the paper-thin walls, telling them what Tom was unable to put into words. A stunned silence followed. They took their place at the table and waited in dazed silence. Anne re-emerged, and as one, the boys gathered around her, murmuring words of comfort. "Does Eileen know?" Will asked his father, after the initial shock was over. "Not yet." "I'll drive over," Will said. "She wouldn't want to hear news like this over the phone." Will slipped out of the house, returning 15 minutes later with Eileen and her husband Frank. Frank was a policeman who was inclined to be a bit loud, but was also capable of quiet seriousness when needed. Now he was grave and subdued as Eileen ran to her father and clenched him tightly, his shirt catching both her murmured words and her tears. When she released her father, she moved to her mother, who was sitting at the table. She fell to her knees, burying her head in her mother's lap. Anne stroked her daughter's head and falsely reassured her that everything would be all right. Everything was not going to be all right. Her son, her baby, was gone, and no amount of tears, no amount of condolences or prayers would change that. The day seemed interminable to Anne as friends and neighbors came and went. The news had spread like brush fire. She accepted their murmured condolences. Part of her was going through the motions. The inner core of her being had withdrawn from all that was happening around her. Eileen disappeared and returned with 2 boxes from the dress shop in town. Listlessly, Anne looked at the 2 black dresses Eileen had brought back with her and chose one to please Eileen, thinking, "What need have I for the trappings of sorrow? I shall mourn him to my dying breath." Dr. O'Neill called at 11 the next morning. Tom took the call, nodding to the phone instead of speaking. A moment later, he said a hushed, "Thank you," and slowly replaced the handset on its cradle before turning to face the gathered family. "It's done. Dr. O'Neill said that they learned from it, and what they learned will help with the others." He paused. "Now we must get on with what we have to do. Will, you go see the undertaker, then see about getting a grave dug. I'll go see the priest. We'll have the funeral tomorrow morning. One evening at the funeral home is enough for your mother to go through." Anne watched him look from face to face before finally coming to hers. How well she knew him. He had accepted Stephen's death, and now his concern was for her. Will got to his feet. "I'll go right now." "I'll go with you," John volunteered, and they left the house together. When Will and John finally returned, Will sat next to his mother and took her hand in his. "All the men had closed coffins, Mum. Stephen's will be closed, too." "Closed?" "Yes." "I won't be able to see him? Ever?" "No, Mum, not ever." When she failed to say anything further, he said, "It's the way it has to be, Mum." I understand, Will, but it's just so." "I know," Will said as he kissed her hand. "I know." Anne thought of her son lying in a hospital bed, wrapped like a mummy in a plastic cocoon. "I didn't even get a chance to say." Her words trailed off, though her lips were still moving. Her eyes looked at Will, but he knew she couldn't see him. Slowly, recognition came to her. "I'd like to be by myself for a while now," she told him, and went to her bedroom and sat on the bed. A few minutes later, Tom came in and asked, "Are you all right?" She nodded, stood up slowly, and followed him out to join the others, once more going through the motions. In the evening, the family gathered at the house to go to the funeral home. Eileen fussed with Anne's hair and helped her with one of the new dresses. She submitted to the ministrations listlessly, aware of her family's growing concern for her, but stupefied by grief. It was something dimly perceived, then completely lost. Her body and mind were merely going through the motions until she could return to the privacy of her bedroom and put away the pretense of coping. At the funeral home, The family formed a sheltering phalanx around her as a press of townspeople headed towards them. The funeral home had 2 salons where friends and relatives could pay their respects. Stephen's coffin was in Salon A, a dark-paneled room about 20 by 16 feet. Banked with flowers, the coffin rested against the far wall, from which a neon cross cast a bluish tint over the flowers and the framed photograph of Stephen Shaw. Her son, her Stephen, her baby. The sight of the closed coffin sent a shockwave coursing through her body. She forced herself to cross to the padded kneeling bench beside the coffin and knelt to pray. Her mind, tortured by the visions of seared and violated flesh, was unable to form words into prayer. She stared at the coffin for what she thought was an appropriate length of time before blessing herself with the sign of the cross. She kissed her fingers and touched them lightly to the coffin. Images of Stephen flashed through her mind in quick succession. From the moment he was born, he was a happy child and rarely cried. His face changed from a smiling newborn into a toddler, forever the happy little child. She watched as he grew into a strapping young man and the smile on his face when he graduated school. He knew how much graduating pleased her. She pictured his smiling face as he left each morning to go to work. Visions of him alone in that dark mine, burned so badly that the coffin had to be closed, raced before her eyes. Alone in his sterile plastic tent. Alone under the harsh lights on the autopsy table. Alone in his coffin. "Anne," Tom whispered. She roused herself with effort and let him help her to her feet. The family, in pairs, and finally Tom alone, knelt at the coffin with bowed head. Townspeople pressed close to her with their murmured condolences. Later, but for a few, she would be unable to recall the individual faces. Then Vincent, 19 now, slight, hardly taller than herself, stood before her. His expressive eyes immediately caught and held hers. His slender hands, trained at the government school for the handicapped, moved fluidly. What Stephen was to me is beyond measure. Our world will be a sorrier place without him. I grieve for you and for him. Her fingers, like Stephen's, had learned sign language when Vincent had learned, replied, "We will both miss him." Vincent nodded as his hand reached out and patted her shoulder, as Stephen often did to comfort him when they were boys. His eyes began to fill, and he turned away. He turned back to her and signed, "I loved him like a brother." Anne smiled knowingly, and Vincent took his place for the prayer service. The priest came, and one of the undertaker's young assistants passed out printed folders of the prayer service. Murmured cadences rose and fell as the gathering followed the priest in the service. Time passed. More people came and went, until finally the undertaker circulated, murmuring in hushed tones that it was closing time, and the crowd began to melt away. When the salon had emptied except for the family, Tom knelt at the coffin for a departing prayer, then took Anne's arm and led her out to the car. The next morning, after a restless night of chaotic dreams amid snatches of wakefulness, Anne woke as Tom left the bed. Dreading the bitter day, she lay for a time thinking, remembering. She recalled women who, stumbling with grief, had to be supported as they followed the coffin of a loved one from the church after the service. Now she knew the immeasurable sense of loss these women had felt. Finally, she got up and sat on the side of the bed. In all her life, her courage had never failed her. Life had its crises. Hard decisions had to be made. Tom, secure in his manhood and knowing of her quiet strength, left most of those decisions to her, and she had made them unflinchingly as she made the decision on the autopsy. But where was her strength and courage now when she needed them both? The young doctor had been considerate, but his words had hit her like explosive bullets, a shot that had impaired something in her. She sought to regain it, but by the time she was dressed, her resolve had wilted under the weight of the depression that had crushed her spirit with her son's death. Eileen and Frank were in the kitchen with Tom when she entered. Eileen silently gave her tea. It was all Anne could do to stifle the impulse to rush back to the bedroom and close out the world. The drive to the funeral home and from there to the church had an unreal quality about it to her. Streets flowed past. People came into view and passed out again, as if in scenes on a silent television. Remote, something on the periphery of her awareness. The church service had the same remote quality about it. She sat in the front pew, flanked on either side by family. The priest, an earnest younger man, tried to keep the service mercifully short, yet fulfill the church's function to console and make acceptable death in their midst. And she, lost in grief, barely aware of what transpired. Eileen brought her out of her trance-like state by leaving the pew and going to the left side of the church, where the organist and the 5 women who formed the choir that day were seated. The service over, the pallbearers formed up on either side of the coffin. The usher motioned for the family to move out into the aisle. She began to tremble, and Tom took her arm. At that instant, the silence was broken by the sound of the organ, and a clear, pure voice began to sing Amazing Grace. She stopped short, turned her head, and looked in startled disbelief at the singer. Eileen, singing for Stephen. What Eileen was doing was without precedent, an electrifying break with tradition. No one ever sang at the funeral service for their own dead. Eileen, you can't. You'll break, Anne thought, silently warning her. Tom touched her elbow, gently urging her to leave the pew. She moved out into the aisle, and with each step, waited for Eileen, who had never sung in public before, to falter. But she did not falter, and Tom's deep voice took up the song. Will, John, and their wives joined in as they moved down the aisle behind the coffin. Anne was outside and in the car before she fully realized the dreaded walk from the church was over. The service at the hillside graveyard was brief. A brisk breeze blew the priest's words away, and she heard only snatches of the prayers. Her gaze lifted from the coffin suspended above the waiting grave and ranged out over the town below, and came to rest on the stark, black headgear of that coal mine where it towered about the houses. It had cost her husband his lungs, and her son his life. Too much, she thought. Too much, more than could rightly be expected for one's bread. The service ended, and the people began to drift away from the gravesite. Back at the house, the family gathered around the table for tea. Though her mind and spirit reeled under a terrible sense of loss, Anne was vaguely aware that the free-flowing talk that usually marked their gatherings was missing. In its place, a stilted, formalized dialogue of carefully considered and softly enunciated nothings, as if, by circumspection, they could deny the void in their midst. Then Tom brought it out into the open. Christmas, birthdays, will never be the same again. She looked up. His eyes were upon her, and his face mirrored his concern for her. Her. It was to him, with his ruined health, that the concern should be for. Her boy was gone, and she grieved, would always grieve for him, but neither grief nor longing would bring him back. His beautiful march ended. Tom's fate was to march to the ever slower beat of his own drum, and he would need the best she had to give in the dark days ahead. The love that was always there for him flooded her being with an intensity that made her want to cry out. Amid silence, she got up and went into her bedroom. When she came out, she had shed her funeral garb and was dressed in her normal, everyday clothes. She crossed the kitchen and picked up her grandson, kissed him sweetly, and said, "When you're older, Nana's going to tell you all about your Uncle Stephen and how brave and special he was." The baby giggled as Anne kissed him again. "He was a happy baby, just like you, and that's why your mama and daddy named you Stephen." The family gathered around Anne. She looked at each of them and said, "You are never gone when you live in the hearts of the people you leave behind."
Hi everyone, this is Kenn Crawford, author of the zombie novel Dead Hunt, and I hope you enjoyed this short story, Stephen's Song. I found this story amongst the boxes of unpublished manuscripts that my grandfather had written. But this unedited short story caught my attention for two reasons. One, I was a teenager when there was a coal mining disaster in my hometown of Glace Bay. 12 men lost their lives that day, so this story really hit home for me. The second thing that caught my attention was my grandfather did not pen this story. My grandmother did. None of us knew she had a talent for writing. I tried to keep as much of her original text and story idea as I could while staying true to her style of writing. I hope I did it, and her, justice. I want to thank Renee Chambliss for once again lending her wonderful voice to narrate this story for me. She really captured the essence of the character Anne Shaw and of my grandmother, Hannah Crawford. Thanks, Renee, and thank you, Nana, for a wonderful story. For more information on me, Dead Hunt, and other short stories and projects I'm working on, visit me online at kenncrawford.com. And as always, my friends, thank you for listening.
Attention, everyone.
This is the podcast that does just one thing. It helps you turn your novel into a professional-sounding audiobook.